Hello, everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, an institute which, as I hope you all know by now, is dedicated to the promotion and pursuit of prudence and restraint in US foreign and security policy. Uh, if for just a note for today, if as I hope you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. You see the button at the bottom of your screen, and I will pass them on. So today it is a great pleasure to introduce Mark Leonard to talk about his latest book, Surviving Chaos: Geopolitics When the Rules Fail. Mark is co-founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is the first, and I'm not sure if still the only, but certainly the first pan-European think tank. He is a member of the British Foreign Secretary's External Foreign Policy Board, and he previously worked as Director of Foreign Policy at the Centre for European Reform, a British think tank in a country which, alas, is no longer a member of the European Union. But anyway, we might discuss that. And he writes a regular column for Project Syndicate. So, Mark, welcome. Very nice to see you.
Great. It's a huge pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. I found your book absolutely fascinating, and perhaps we could begin. If you could describe the contrast that you draw between what you call artisans and architects in the formation of state international policies and strategy, because I found this a most intriguing idea.
Thank you very much. So the book's called Surviving Chaos, and the kind of starting point that I hope we can talk about in more depth afterwards is the fact that the world is going through a period of, I think, what's going to be protracted chaos, and I think we need to come up with a new vocabulary to talk about it, because a lot of people are either going back and mourning the old order or hoping that a new order is going to emerge. But I think that we're in a situation where there'll be a kind of durable chaos, and I try and come up with a new way of describing that, and talk about this idea of unorder, which we can talk about later. But in this kind of period of unorder, people are thinking, different states are thinking about what their strategies are. And I draw a distinction between what, as you say, I call architects. Those are countries that think about what kind of world they want to live in and develop blueprints for an imaginary world that they want to live in, and then they try and work out how to get from the world that we're in to that sort of world, and work out what kinds of norms and institutions and architecture can underpin that vision for the world that they want to live in. And the models of the architects are obviously the United States of America and Europe after World War II, where people like John Maynard Keynes and Dean Acheson and other people like that tried to create firstly the post-war order, and then it got deepened and expanded after the end of the Cold War to create what is sometimes called the liberal international order, or the rules-based order. But another way of thinking about how you deal with a kind of disordered world is to try and work out how you can survive what the world throws at you. So rather than starting with a blueprint for a perfect world, you work out where you think the world is going anyway, and you adapt to that. And the artisans don't start with blueprints and try and build great things from scratch. They tend to adapt to the circumstances that they're in. They'll often reuse old materials for new purposes. They'll try things out. There'll be a lot of bricolage and improvise with different tactics. If they work well, they'll expand them. If they don't work so well, they'll try other things out. And the model for that, in my mind, is China, that has come back to the global prime time in an order which it didn't create in someone else's order, and it's kind of looked at both how to adapt it. So they've been active in a lot of the different institutions of the post-war and post-Cold War order. They've developed their own mechanisms around it, and tried things out, whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or the BRICS or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They've pushed back in some areas. They've tried out things in other areas. And rather than sort of trying to build an order, a global order, which is like the order that the US built after World War II, they thought more about how to make themselves resilient to a much more chaotic world and how to position themselves so that they're the prime beneficiaries of that chaos. So both how do you survive it yourself and how can you benefit from things which are going on in the world anyway? And it's a very, very different way of thinking about where we're at the moment. And whereas for the last few years, Western leaders have often talked about preserving order or building order or the rules-based order, the Chinese president Xi Jinping, his favorite phrase has been to talk about great changes unseen in a century, which is basically a statement that what he's expecting is, rather than order, is a lot of disruptive change. And that is the challenge for Chinese foreign policy, is how to stay abreast of all of these changes.
I found what you said about China's approach particularly interesting. China's approach to policy in general, including most notably domestic economic policy, because in many ways it's very different from the standard stereotype in the West of clearly worked out, centralized, rigid strategies aiming at, clear goals within a given time frame. Perhaps you could say something about what we can learn from the Chinese in that regard.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing which is very important is that they do not expect a settled world, and they're not kind of and they I think people are right to think that China is extraordinarily ambitious, that it's not happy with the status quo, and that it wants a bigger role for itself, and that it's trying to build all sorts of relationships with other players, and is pushing back very actively on what it sees as Western hegemony in every single field, from the economy to foreign policy to diplomacy to bilateral relations with different countries. So in that sense, it is challenging the West in all sorts of different ways. But what it isn't doing is trying to replace a US-led order with a Chinese order where China is delivering global public goods in the way that the US sought to beforehand. And I think we've also seen something which is much more improvisational and much more experimental than it's sometimes given credit for. You saw that, as you said, with Chinese political economy when Deng Xiaoping starts these big process of opening and reform at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. He famously talks about crossing the river by feeling for stones. So and if the whole process of starting these economic reforms is very much turning China into a giant laboratory where you test things out in a tentative way, and if they work well, then you expand them. And you saw that with the dual track pricing system and the creation of special economic zones, and the way that particularly places like Shenzhen and the Pearl River Delta and other places were seen as a way of testing things out, which then got broadened to the rest of China. And I think that is also the approach which lies behind even some of the things which we mistakenly in the West think of as top down, central planning. So because part of the challenge is they've obviously taken on board a sort of Leninist political model, and a lot of the vocabulary that the Chinese use comes from the Soviet Union. So they talk about 5-year plans, and these are kind of central things. But a Chinese 5-year plan is very, very different in nature, I think, to a Soviet 5-year plan. So the Soviet 5-year plans are much more architectural. So you'll have clear targets, and you'll see there'll be very detailed implementation ideas behind it. Whereas a Chinese 5-year plan is often much more about setting a goal, which then the whole of the Chinese system gets behind, but does it in a way that is much messier and much more decentralized. So you have every single provincial authority, all the local communist parties, the state-owned enterprises and other people will try and work out how to achieve that goal. But they often do it in a way that's very competitive with one another and quite kind of messy. And you have a sort of almost Darwinian competition between all of these different levels of government and the different people who get subsidies to achieve these things, which if you had a sort of central planning mindset would look very, very wasteful and disorderly. And there is certainly a lot of graft and duplication and white elephants being built. But at the end of the day, China manages often to go from having absolutely nothing to being a world leader in areas where it had no prior expertise, like electric vehicles and batteries and a lot of the technologies of the future. And you can see that in the economic sphere, but you can see parallel developments also in the diplomatic sphere, in the political sphere, which we can talk about as well.
I mean, in my conversations with the Chinese, they've been very anxious to stress that they do, against, once again, some of this narrative you hear in the West and particularly in Washington, that they do not want to be themselves a force of disruption. They do not regard themselves, as contributing to chaos, because they say, to me at least, I think fairly convincingly, as the greatest trading nation on earth, the last thing that they want to do is contribute to economic chaos and the disruption of the world trading system. They do, of course, want to maximize their advantages in it. But of course, this line of the Chinese has gained considerable strength recently. I mean, since you wrote your book, from the US and Israeli strategy in the Middle East, because of course the Chinese say, we just wanted to keep the oil flowing. This disruption to the world economy is not our fault. And indeed, we had absolutely no desire or motive to do anything like this.
Well, I think actually, in many ways, if you look at the long term, China is going to be a much more disruptive force in our models of political economy than the US is. But Trump's theatricality is such that by design, it's very difficult not to talk about him, and everyone is obsessed with every single latest twist and turn of American foreign policy and what he writes on Truth Social and in other places. And it's definitely true that just, obviously in the last few months, we've had the war in Iran, we've had Greenland, we've had Venezuela, we've had all of, Liberation Day and his tariffs in different places. And it does feel like there's a huge amount of chaos being delivered to the world from on a kind of conveyor belt from the White House. But and China is not behaving in that way at all. But because of its scale and because of the way that China has been developing its economy, actually it is creating a huge amount of, it's both preparing for chaos and disruption. And I think the Chinese don't see Trump as the primary source of chaos and disruption in the world. I think they think that there are big structural changes going on. And that's what lies behind this phrase of great changes unseen in a century, where Xi Jinping is talking about, huge demographic changes, where we're going from a world that was dominated by Americans and Europeans in the 1950s towards one where there'll be more people in Africa and in Asia than anywhere else. Changes to the way our economies are powered as a result of climate change and the carbon transition. Changes to our technology as a result of AI and quantum computing and all these other kind of technological revolutions which are going to turn our economies on their heads. And also changes to the nature of global capitalism as it becomes more and more complicated and more crisis prone and more weaponized. And those things in the Chinese mind are going to scramble power relations and lead to a lot of political and geopolitical chaos. And China actually is the kind of prime mover behind a lot of those four sets of changes, which I talked about, are all ones where China is the prime mover when it comes to to climate change. China is both the biggest emitter and the author of the green technologies, which will kind of save us from climate change. When it comes to the new technologies, China is either, one of the top two powers or the leading power in a lot of the kind of key technologies of the future. When it comes to demography, China's obviously one of the most populous countries in the world and is building relationships with through the Belt and Road Initiative and with all these other moves it's done with the global south to try and to align itself with these future civilizational powers in the 21st century. And then capitalism used to be something with which people associate with America, but nowadays if you come across capital and if you're looking for trading relationships, China is the number one power in most parts of the world. So China is behind a lot of these disruptive changes, but is also trying to insulate itself from them. So a lot of Chinese policy has been about building self-reliance and insulating itself from the chaos which comes from a system that is being kind of turned on its head. And it's true that they try and pose as the adults in the room when Trump is launching trade wars and bringing tariffs in. But at the same time, they have been pretty disruptive in their fight back, whether it comes to the way that they have turned rare earths and magnets into tools of power so that they can use the choke points which they have on the global economy to put pressure on the US and on other countries. But also I'm sitting in Europe at the moment, and the big debates in a lot of European capitals are about the deindustrialization of Europe as a result of China having these enormous industrial surpluses which are coming our way because the US market has been closed as a result of Trump's tariffs.
Yeah, though of course, I mean, in Britain and America, to a great extent, deindustrialization was a choice we ourselves made, or at least well, the two of us didn't, but previous governments did.
We were victims of it, Anatole, I think. No.
Well, yes, it wasn't my fault. But coming to Europe, because your book is very much directed at, as you say, as a European to Europeans, and we are both Europeans, even though, alas, our country is, well, that's the thing. I mean, Britain, when it left the European Union, did not cease to be a European country, any more than, I don't know, whatever, Austria was a European country, or Sweden before they joined the European Union. So one has to be a bit careful of, making that, what you call it, identification. But what are your ideas as to how the European Union, insofar as it does represent Europe, with its very particular and unique configuration, which of course is not like anything else in the world today, or indeed anything that has ever existed, how does it try to survive, as you say, this new world, or even benefit, perhaps?
So thank you very much. So my starting point is that in this kind of age of unorder, it is the hour of the artisan rather than the architect, and that there are kind of 5 different ways that artisans are better placed than architects to deal with this world. And I kind of argue that Europeans need to change their mindset, because in many ways they have been the biggest beneficiaries of the so-called rule-based liberal international order over the last few decades, and therefore have a big sense of loss and have been mourning the end of that order, and were slow to recognize in what a parlous shape it was in beforehand, because they were very much status quo powers in that respect. So they have to get out of a mode of grief management and start to work out how to exist in this new world. And I suppose the kind of main things are, firstly, it's about whether you embrace change or resist it. And I think the temptation in Europe has been to be in favor of preserving the status quo ante. And I kind of argue that order was kind of already on its last legs before America launched a revolution against it, that was lacking legitimacy and it wasn't seen as real by many parts of the world. And now that the US has decided to exit from it, it's not realistic for Europeans to think that they can preserve it. So therefore, they need to accept that that order is gone and look for agency rather than trying to preserve the order in this kind of different world. And the way to do that then is relate to some of these other changes. So I think the sort of second change is equally difficult for Europeans, which is to lose their sort of universalist thinking. So part of the challenge for Europeans is that since the Enlightenment, at least, they've sort of thought that whatever ideas come out of the European political settlement should be relevant for all people in all countries for all time. And, that's led them to be quite preachy on the world stage and to judge other people by standards which are being developed within their own politics. And I sort of argue that we need to move from universalism to exceptionalism. I think that a lot of these values and norms that have been developed through hard battles in our own countries are wonderful and worth preserving. But the place to preserve them is within our polities, rather than thinking that we have the standing or legitimacy to tell other people how to lead their lives and to try and impose them on other people. So getting ready for a world of pluralism where you coexist with other peoples who make different choices and negotiate with them, rather than thinking in universal terms. And then the third thing I think is to do with how we think about interdependence and connections, because we've basically been part of the creation of a global world through empire, through the Industrial Revolution, through globalization after the end of the Cold War, and we tended to think that globalization was about us changing other people, and that it was a positive thing for that reason. And therefore, in comparison with China, for example, which saw globalization and interdependence a bit like fire, something that gives you enormous benefits, but you have to be careful to control it and make sure you don't burn yourself. We're increasingly learning that interdependence is a very positive thing. It can turn former enemies into friends, as France and Germany managed to do after the Second World War. But it can also open you up to blackmail, to oppression by other players. So therefore, calibrating your connections with other people. The fourth thing is a different way of thinking about our security. So typically, architects often think that the best way to stay secure is to defend yourself from the outside in. So you externalize your security by creating norms, institutions, structures at a global level, which then, whether it's geographical extremities where you say that our security begins in the Hindu Kush, or whether it's more about seeing institutions like the World Trade Organization or NATO or other things like that keeping you safe. But whereas the Chinese think that security starts from the inside out. So you start by making yourself resilient and secure. So from a European perspective, that is a big shift, because we basically outsourced most of our thinking of security to the United States. We've seen institutions like NATO and the United Nations and other things as the kind of core custodians of our security. Whereas now, I think it's time for Europeans to take responsibility for their own security, to realize that the transatlantic relationship, as it was developed over the last few decades, is ended, and that we're in a kind of different era. So that is quite a big shift, but isn't just about military relations. I think it is more in China. They've got this doctrine that what Xi Jinping calls a holistic approach to national security, where you think about the securitization of everything from your kind of financial system to your trade system to your technology. And I think that's something which needs to be done. And then the kind of final shift is about control. So if you're an architect, you have this kind of idea that you can control everything, and you often develop these sort of quite ambitious ways of doing it. So a good example of that, which you've written about brilliantly, is on climate change, for example, where Europeans tend to think that you can create global solutions which will mean that countries move from making decisions based on politics to science. They go from competition to cooperation, and these things become kind of constitutionalized and legalized. Whereas the Chinese tend to think that these big forces can't really be controlled, so you should work out how to adapt to things which are happening anyway. And, you know, on climate change, for example, the Chinese have decided that the best way of dealing with it has been to try and align what they're doing on climate with what they're trying to do in other areas. So to link the energy transition to their development policy. And they turned it into a competitive thing where China gets competitive advantage by becoming the number one player on solar panels, on electric vehicles and other sorts of things like that. And actually, ironically, it's those sorts of competitive things which are probably going to do the most to save us from catastrophic climate change, rather than cooperating and having cap and trade schemes and things like that. But anyway, it's a different way of thinking about agency. So you focus on what you can control and you do that, but you don't have the sort of illusion that you can control the whole world.
I mean, staying with climate change for the moment, I mean, as you say, I've made this argument myself in a book. And you also talk, which I greatly welcomed in your book, about something which there's been, you know, almost a kind of irrational knee-jerk allergy against in environmentalist circles, which is geoengineering. Which the Chinese are thinking about, which in my view, we may, you know, if things continue on their present trajectory, we will all have to think about. But there, of course, as you say, some measure of cooperation, agreement, coordination is also terribly important, because if we get into competitive, let alone, God forbid, militarized efforts at geoengineering, the consequences could be appalling.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of my big worries is that, as I said at the very beginning, I've been sort of trying to come up with a way of understanding where we're at the moment in terms of order. And a lot of people say that we're in a period of disorder, but I think the idea of disorder implies that there is some sort of consensus on what order looks like. And Kissinger said that order has these two components: a kind of balance of power and at least a minimum agreement of rules which people can live by. You know, whether they're rules that people actively embrace or ones that they just have to live with because they don't have the power to resist them. And unfortunately, we don't really have either of those things at the moment. We're in a kind of period where there's a big power transition taking place, and where there isn't really an agreement on rules. So therefore, it's not that people are breaking the rules. If you look at the situation in Iran or in some other areas, it's, you know, the rules could not have been less relevant to people in Tel Aviv or in Washington when they were planning the start of this war. And even Iran's response is doesn't make any sense from a perspective of international law, where they kind of push back against countries that attack them, like Israel, but they equally attack countries like Oman and Qatar that were not involved in the attacks at all, just because they were within the range of their missiles and drones.
Well, no, and have American bases on their soil, which makes them, in terms of international law, a legitimate target. You can't host bases which attack another country and then not expect to be attacked in return, can
Well,
you?
not all the bases were being used to attack them. So I don't think that Oman was a co-belligerent. I don't think Qatar was a co-belligerent in the. But my sense is that we're in a kind of period where, rather than if you compare, if you look at, anyway, I was going to go on to the geoengineering afterwards, but what's interesting about the Iran war is how so many things which we thought of as norms, you know, quite basic ones, not advanced rules, like the idea that you don't attack civilian infrastructure, that you that there should be that you should, people didn't even bother. If you compare it with the Iraq war, for example, it is dramatically different. So a lot of people would say the Iraq war was an illegal war, but George Bush and people in his administration tried to make a legal case for launching the war. They tried to build a coalition. They went to the United Nations. And it's true, when they didn't get a resolution in favor of it, they attacked anyway. But then there was a lot of work done to try and persuade people that this was within the rules. Whereas what happened on Iran was very, very different. There was no attempt to build an international coalition. There was no attempt to try and create a convincing casus belli. There wasn't any attempt to build any kind of international agreement around it. And, I think the Iranian response made a lot of sense in terms of strategy, but I don't think it was overly influenced by a sense of how to win a kind of legal argument about what was going on. So I think it's more a case where it's not that people are breaking the rules; it's that the rules have just lost a purchase on what a lot of actors are doing at the moment and have been overtaken by a new reality. And that's one of the challenges when you look at geoengineering and all of these other issues, where if anything goes and people are basically just competing with each other in a way that is quite clearly unbounded by norms and by rules. How do you deal with these new technologies, which could have which could create existential risk for us, whether it's AI, whether it's geoengineering, and it's very hard to go back to a situation where you have the sorts of relationships that were developed over time during the Cold War between great powers that were in competition with each other, but where they took a lot of things off the table and they had mechanisms for trying to minimize the existential risk that we're in. I think the world was probably in many ways more dangerous during the Cold War than it is today, but there were, I think, more norms and more attempts at creating stability and trying to they were built up over time, but you had a more stable balance of power than you have at the moment. It's quite hard to see how you can go about establishing those sorts of norms, and particularly around these new technologies. And if you look at the way that, for example, we're moving towards much more autonomous warfare. And, I think geoengineering for me is in that sort of box where, because there is a strong competitive logic, it's quite hard to see how you go about winning an argument in any, whether it's in the White House, whether it's in Zhongnanhai, whether it's in the Kremlin, to say that restraint is the best way forward, when the kind of logic of the security debate in a lot of these countries is that we're in a race and that it's a winner takes all race in each of these different technological areas, and therefore we're seeing an erosion of these norms rather than an attempt to create ways of de-risking these new technologies.
I mean, on AI, I think you're absolutely right, because, as you say, I mean, that is also intimately connected with warfare and, with developing new military strengths. With climate change, it does seem to me that, if you look at the Arctic, for example, there is really no need to approach, the melting of the ice in the Arctic as if the principal threat were that more Russian and Chinese ships will sail around, because after all, nuclear submarines have been sailing around under the ice for generations now.
But you say that just as the president of the United States is trying to get Greenland.
Well, I know, but I think he's wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, the point is we can still make that argument. But on AI, I mean, you talked about China, creating security from the inside out. But I mean, there is a strong argument today that the biggest threat, well, US is one case, but to European liberal democracy is internal, and that there are really serious and evident risks that it could get much worse. I mean, first, if the pessimists on AI are right, and it does create mass unemployment very quickly. I mean, we don't know that it will, but obviously there is a clear risk. And the other thing, of course, is that climate change in Africa and the Middle East will drive waves of migration, the reaction against which will basically shut down liberal democracy in Europe. And I mean, there clearly you see that already well in progress. This, however, has, I mean, except that military competition makes it much more difficult to regulate AI. These two threats are not in themselves, the product of geopolitics, and it's not clear that they can be addressed by classical security means. What do you think? I mean, how great a threat are these to the European Union and European democracies in their present form?
So I think I think Xi Jinping's right to talk about these great changes, and I think those are two of these kind of things which are going to be massively disruptive. And I do worry a lot about the ability of our societies and of our political regimes to cope with them and to find a way through them. But I think the best way to deal with them is to have more of an artisan's mindset, where, because these things are very unpredictable. We've seen over the last decade how much exogenous crises can change our politics and can create new political forces. In the last decade, Europeans have dealt with the global financial crisis and the euro crisis. We've had COVID. We've had the full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the economic inflation crisis that followed after that. We've had various other kind of shocks which come out of climate change and the energy transition, which and they've these. Adam Tooze has popularized this term of the polycrisis, which Edgar Morin developed. And these crises have, I think, fundamentally changed the nature of European politics. One of the most interesting illustrations for me is the German party, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, which is born out of the financial crisis, because Angela Merkel said there is no alternative to bailing out other countries and developing frameworks around that. And it was originally called the Professors' Party, because you had a load of ordo-liberal professors who were challenging the economic orthodoxy. And then shortly afterwards, the party reinvented itself as an anti-refugee party during the refugee crisis in 2015. Then they became an anti-vax party during COVID. Then they became a green lash party when there was a Green Party was in government, and they were introducing measures on boilers. And they're sort of crisis entrepreneurs. They go from one crisis to the next. And they're now the most popular party in Germany. And you've seen a similar thing in the UK with Nigel Farage, going from being anti-EU to anti-immigrant to being a green lash party as well. It's a very similar kind of trajectory in France with the National Rally, which is the most popular party. They've had the similar kind of approach. So it does show how these crises, as you said, create the biggest single threat to liberal democracy and to our kind of values internally. And the management of these crises by the state, and therefore the perceived failure to manage them, has created the space for these parties to emerge. So I think it is a big threat, but it also shows why the best approach to these crises is to be more honest with people, and to, rather than trying to talk a lot about order and to project a false sense of control, is to be much more open with the public about the fact that there are these things going on, to try and understand who the winners and losers are, to have a politics that helps the losers of it, rather than allowing yourself to be portrayed as on the side of elites, bailing banks out, but allowing ordinary people to have their houses repossessed, allowing energy companies to make record profits while ordinary people's bills go up, etc. So I think you need to have a politics that's much more attuned to the losers of these crises. You need to be honest about what you can do to get through them, rather than sort of talking a lot about order, which a lot of these governments have done beforehand. But also, I do think that as Europeans, in some ways, we should be in a better place to deal with them than countries without a welfare state like China and America. If you imagine that AI, and as you say, we have no idea exactly how the disruptions of AI are going to transform our labor markets and our societies. But if the kind of doom and gloom mongers are even half right, that large percentage of the population, particularly educated people who are used to having their voice heard, find themselves unemployed and redundant as a result of these changes, that could make the Great Depression and the problems of the 1930s look like trivial events. And if you've got a welfare state, if you've got a set of institutions which are designed to absorb some of these economic shocks, I would have thought that would put you in a better place to be resilient than countries which basically allow the kind of gales of global capitalism to blow through their societies without any protection for ordinary people. But it does create a big challenge for the political economy of European countries if a lot of the tax base was based on income tax and on national insurance contributions. How do you go about creating a fiscal framework where you're getting enough money from the companies which are making huge profits out of this? So I think there are enormous challenges of reform, but at the same time, potentially the European welfare model might actually make us a bit less destabilized than other countries that don't have those frameworks to absorb the shocks and to give people some protection from these enormous changes which are going to come our way very, very quickly.
But not, of course, if our welfare systems are simultaneously trying to support huge numbers of immigrants.
Well, I think what you're seeing at the moment is obviously immigration as one of the top debates, and it's one of the areas which these far right parties have used to build support for themselves. But it's interesting how much the political debates have changed, where mainstream parties are developing a different approach. But we're also about to go for a period where the poor demography that European countries have got comes to the fore, and it's not entirely clear what happens when AI takes over, and if you've got low birth rates and low population. Certainly in China, they're doing more to put those two debates together to work out how to link their demography with the economic transformations that AI is going to bring about.
But does this not perhaps suggest that in this case, artisanship may not be enough, and that actually, we will need, because you said, the changes could be colossal, and we might need something more like a new architecture to deal with them. As in America, FDR introduced a set of changes which by American standards were, radically new.
I think for me, the artisanship versus architecture is more a mindset about not trying to plan around stability and constancy. It doesn't mean that you don't do big and ambitious things. I mean, if you look at China, for example, the period of the last kind of 20, 30 years is quite extraordinary. They have poured more cement and built more houses than anyone has done in the whole of human history. They have taken more people out of poverty than most people, than even existed in the whole world a century ago. And they have compressed 3 centuries of modernization into 3 decades. So it's not like they're standing still, but they are doing these big and bold things in a way that is much more improvisational and characterized by trial and error and uncertainty rather than certainty. And I think that's the mindset that we need. But I agree that the best way of dealing with these things isn't to put our head in the sand and to go about with incrementalism. I think we have to try big things out, but we have to do it in the knowledge that we're almost certainly wrong about lots of things which are going to happen, and that we're going to need to potentially change course quite quickly during maybe several times in the next few years.
To adapt a phrase from warfare by, I think it was General Eisenhower, planning is everything. The plan is nothing.
Very good.
Yeah. Though here, I mean, from a kind of, I don't know, pessimist, I mean, I hope too pessimistic point of view, but there is, of course, a question about the European Union. Because, in your book, you stress the continued importance of nation states and, how these have endured despite all the predictions of a generation ago. But of course, the European Union is made up of nation states. And as we see, national allegiances remain very strong. Is it because I remember you write about how the Chinese took 9 months to draw up a new set of rules for AI. The European Union took 3 years, but of course, that isn't the fault of some sort of stupid hidebound bureaucracy. That's the way the EU works. It has to work because it has to negotiate, between its different members. But is that a crucial difficulty or danger for you as far as the EU is concerned, or is it something that can in fact be overcome or managed?
So one of my favourite books about the European Union is a book which I'm sure you know as well, by a British historian called Alan Millward, called The European Rescue of the Nation State. And he sort of, it was at the time a kind of revisionist account of how the EU developed, and said actually that it wasn't a result of heroic plans to create a United States of Europe to destroy the nation state, but actually the European Union and the European integration process, I mean, before the European Union exists, its precursors were very much about rescuing the nation states of Europe from the rubble that existed at the end of the Second World War. And what has been interesting to me in these crises that we've been through, which we discussed earlier, is that almost every single time, even the kind of nationalists in European countries realize that if you're a sovereigntist and a nationalist, you can't just rely on unilateral action to have agency against Trump, against Xi Jinping, against Putin, against COVID. And there's often a sense that either you develop action with other European countries, or you'll see your sovereignty disappear. And that has led to that, coupled with the catastrophe of Brexit, has led a lot of these far right parties to change their politics on Europe.
Yes.
So 10 years ago, Marine Le Pen talked about Frexit and leaving the European Union. Now you don't hear anyone in France talking about leaving the European Union or leaving the euro. They talk about refounding it, making it more sovereignty friendly. And I think, what we're going to see is probably as a result of these great changes and uncertainties, a lot of demand for Europe to do more things together, but in a way that doesn't put European integration in the EU as something which comes at the expense of national sovereignty and nation states, but is rather something that amplifies it. And I think they'll probably both do integration in a slightly different way, but also talk about it in a different way. And I think that's a healthy thing, where rather than trying to replace national identity, what you're doing is creating a platform where you can actually be a proud French person in charge of your own destiny because you're working together with other countries. in Europe. And I think that 10 years of Brexit has led a lot of people in Britain to come to the same conclusions. So a lot of people who voted leave in 2016 now want to have much closer cooperation with other European countries and realize that if you're serious about economic growth, if you want to work out how you can stay safe in a world where the US wants to pull back, and even if you want to stop illegal migrants and small boats from showing up on your shores, you're better placed to do that if you've got a close working relationship with your European neighbours than if you try and do things on your own.
Yeah. A question from the audience about your title in part. Would you really call it a chaotic world, or rather, as you've also said, just a fast-changing world? Because the questioner says that chaotic gives an indication that we are unable to foresee the consequences of our actions, whereas making risks more visible and tracing likely consequences may do some good in planning. I mean, is chaos perhaps a too negative or pessimistic way of presenting the situation?
I think it's chaos in several senses. One, because as I said earlier, I think order does tend to depend on a reasonably stable balance of power between different countries. And I think what we're likely to see is quite big changes in the balance of power, some which are long running and incremental, but some which are much faster. And as a result of these unpredictable structural forces, which we talked about earlier. So I think the power relationships are not stable. I think they are kind of changing, and that leads states to make decisions which challenge the status quo. They'll try things out, and you'll get responses to that, which will be kind of destabilizing and create more and more chaos. And secondly, as I said before, I think there's been erosion of the norms and the rules which different countries were willing to live by. I don't think that the US is any longer seeing itself as a custodian of that order, and lots of other countries were already questioning its legitimacy beforehand. And there are lots of so-called middle powers that are emerging and are quite enjoying the new agency that they have in this world. So I think we're going to see a lot of geopolitical tussling for power and for influence between different places as a result of that uncertainty. But I think the other thing which is maybe different from other changes is that this is all taking place within the context of a hyper-connected world, which is therefore also much less predictable. So scientists make a difference between complicated and complex situations. A complicated thing is like a watch where you have a very lots of different pieces. It's really difficult to work out how it gets put together. But it is, as you say, you can work out if you take one piece out what the likelihood of it having an impact on other things. Whereas a complex situation is something where you not only have lots of different parts, but they all have kind of agency and they're interacting in ways which are not predictable, and where the outcomes are quite open, and where there's so many variables that it's really hard to work out where you're going to end up. And you know, if you look at the projections people are making for climate, for AI, for other sorts of things like that, they are very complex. And if you put them all together, they're even more kind of complex. So I think it's going to be chaotic in that sense, that it's quite hard for us, even with the biggest brains in the world, to work out. There are multiple possible futures which are quite plausible and possible when it comes to climate change, when it comes to AI, when it comes to financial crises and things like that. And if you put them all together in a world where everyone is interconnected, where states are interconnected, but also individuals are, it's almost impossible to know what the future will hold. And therefore, I think that does mean that it's impossible for us to plan effectively and to have long range planning if there's so many moving parts. So that you could call it fast moving changes if you want, but from the perspective of sort of classic command and control planning, it will feel like chaos.
Mm. But I suppose, yeah, I mean, humanity has lived with chaos in the sense of no overarching order for a very long time. Though, of course, that also meant that there were constant wars. Um,
Right?
can the contemporary capitalist globalized, what a hateful word, but anyway, globalized world survive without an overarching order?
So it's true that for most of humanity, we haven't had those kind of rules, but for most of humanity, people were not connected to each other. I think I think there are many things about the world that we're living in now which are genuinely unprecedented. One is just the number of people living on the planet, which is kind of crazy compared to anything beforehand. Secondly, the number of connections between us, both between states but also between individuals, that is unprecedented. And The speed with which those connections take place, and and then some of the things that we've done to the planet. The amount of all of the facts which we know about the Anthropocene. Um, you know, I have a sentence in my book about how, in some ways, uh, we're living with a history that we can't escape. So a lot of the things which are happening to us now are the build-up of decisions that we made in past decades, whether it's climate change through industrialization, whether it's the kind of inequalities and of our capitalist development, which are kind of catching up with us, whether it's the demographic changes which have been taking place slowly over time, which are sort of catching up with us. But also, so it's a past we can't escape, and then it's a future that we can't understand, because a lot of these things people haven't lived through before, and the combination of all of them is genuinely new. And that is the dilemma which a lot of governments have, that you can go back and you can say, okay, there are obviously parallels between our world and the 19th century. In many ways, it's definitely true that the last few decades after the end of the Cold War were quite unusual, because you had a hegemon that was so much more powerful than other players, and there were a set of institutions which didn't exist during previous periods of time at a global scale, etc., etc. So a lot of people think we're going back to earlier periods, and they're kind of saying, is this a new Cold War? Is it like a new 19th century? And there are obviously things we can learn from some of those other periods. But I think there's a lot that is genuinely new and distinct about where we're at in the moment. And as far as capitalism is concerned, it's true that capitalists prefer to have a degree of predictability in institutions, but capitalism has existed through all sorts of different geopolitical orders, and one of its geniuses is its ability to adapt to what's going on at the moment. And I think the nature of capitalism is being changed by our new geopolitical configuration, and lots of companies are having to move from a world where they thought that the nation state didn't exist anymore, and where it was all about efficiency and building supply chains with as little redundancy in them as possible, towards a world where there is a lot more friction, and where politics and geopolitics is much more important. And companies are having to reimagine who they are. And lots of companies that thought of themselves as global are discovering that they're really quite national, and often having to decouple within their own structures in order to deal with a new geopolitical reality.
Yes, well, we may all have to rediscover or rethink who we are in the decades to come. Mark, thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion, and thanks to the audience for attending. And I hope that you will all read Mark's book, Surviving Chaos: Geopolitics When the Rules Fail. Mark, thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been really lovely talking to you, Anatol.
Bye bye.
Bye.